France made a serious contribution, not just to U.S. security with that, but to global security, and in a way that was directly flew in the face of his initial reaction to the conflict, which demonstrates leadership and growth, and it's welcome to see.
Do you think he's been deliberately put in this position by President Trump to give him an apprenticeship to set him up to potentially be the next president?
That's, I think, a reasonable analysis. Uh, Vance is obviously a smart man, although not very well schooled in national security policy. But this is a great way to learn it. And I think that may well be the president's intention.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today, as we continue to analyse the implications of the just over 2 hour phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin on Monday, and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says he's currently waiting for Russia's conditions for a ceasefire. We've got the privilege of talking to Ambassador John Herbst. Now, Ambassador Herbst is a senior director for the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. He served for 31 years in the Foreign Service as a Foreign Service officer in the US Department of State. And he was US ambassador to Ukraine between 2003 and 2006, when he worked to enhance not just US-Ukraine relations, but helped ensure the conduct of fair Ukrainian presidential election. Ambassador, welcome back to Frontline.
My pleasure. It's always good to be with you.
Now, we're trying to analyse still, the implications of this phone call that everyone's talking about. It seems that trade has jumped up again and seems to be a motivating factor, and we keep hearing about trade as negotiations are going on. But Marco Rubio has turned around and said he's waiting for the Russians to outline their ceasefire conditions. We've seen the president and presidential team in the United States flip from attacking Zelensky and the Ukrainians to supporting Zelensky and the Ukrainians and saying they're going to come down hard on the Russians, and then not coming down hard on the Russians and backing off. Where do you think President Trump stands?
He stands today having helped Putin get out of a little bit of a tight corner. 2 Sundays ago, Zelensky with Macron, Merz, Starmer, and I think one other European leader had agreed in Kiev that if Putin did not accept a ceasefire on Monday, the 12th of May, there'd be major new sanctions. That group called Trump, and they thought they had Trump more or less in agreement with them. Putin, seeing a problem, said, well, how about direct Ukraine-Russia talks? Zelensky correctly said, this is a stall. He won't go. But then Trump said, this is a great thing. Zelensky said, okay, I'm going to Turkey to meet with the Russians. And then when Putin chose not to go, and when Putin's low-level minions put in place a diktat piece demanding concessions Ukraine could never accept reasonably, and when Putin was being criticized, Trump threw some cover to Putin, saying, look, he didn't go because I wasn't going to be there. If we're going to solve this problem, we have to sit together. And so the phone call that took place 2 days ago was hyped, including by Trump, to get the bloodletting stopped. And Witkoff, the special envoy, said Trump would use his special charm and force of personality to move the Russians. And when Putin was unmoved by Trump and said, I think we have to continue the direct negotiations, Trump said, Jawohl. A very bad look for President Trump, because an immediate ceasefire was something Trump is trying to achieve, and the Russians are clearly in the way. So right now, it looks like Putin is dictating the course of American diplomacy, which is a very bad look for the United States, and means the chances of actually getting a peace in Ukraine are much less. Because Trump set out at the beginning of his term a smart approach, a peace based upon, a durable peace, based upon concessions by both Ukraine and Russia, and the intention of the United States to use its great power to put pressure on the side that doesn't want to make peace. And it's very clear it's Putin who does not want to make peace.
Yeah, well, 61% of Americans, according to a Harvard Capps and Harris poll, suggest that they're unhappy with Trump's stance on Russia and Putin. And using your phrase from your last update that you wrote, I think it was published yesterday, did Trump blink?
I think it's pretty clear, and I don't say that happily. And I have a lot of colleagues who think Trump's intention is to throw Ukraine to the Russian bear. I disagree with them. And I think that Trump has laid out a sensible approach, which I just described. But for some reason, he does not want to put pressure where pressure is required. And you also mentioned something else about trade. Uh, I was amazed, stupefied even, a month or so ago when the Trump administration announced their intention to have a quote unquote reset with Russia. Obama's weak and bad idea, which they've resurrected. Uh, we've not had the Obama reset was a failure, a geopolitical failure for the United States. And no American, excuse me, there's not been an American economic boon by investing in Russia at any time in history, including in the post Cold War period when a lot of American firms went in. And there's one more thing which is even crazier. Trump is right about how Biden weakened the United States with a clumsy energy policy, a green energy transition. And Trump wants to restore American energy, and he's been doing that. That's great. And he, as a candidate, criticized the Democrats for their weak policy on Nord Stream 2 before the Russian big invasion. Yet now Trump's team is talking about restoring Russian energy supplies to Europe as part of a deal after peace is achieved. Whose natural gas is not going to be sold in Europe if that happens? American natural gas. So American gas producers are livid about this. It's a bad idea from a geopolitical point of view, given what the Russians do with energy, and from an economic point of view. Completely incomprehensible.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that from an energy perspective, because also from a defense perspective, the U.S. defense industrial base is a big defense industrial base, and NATO has relied on it to supply its ammunition, a lot of its weapons, and it's been sold around the world. But do you think some of the policies that have come out of the White House and the push to, I believe, rightly get Europe to stand up and take greater responsibility for its defense, but with some of the question marks that have been put around about US continuing support, is actually undermining the US defense industrial base when it comes to its export capability, and giving an opportunity for European defense industry to step up and fill that void?
There's no doubt about what you just said. Although I think that the administration is in a solid place now regarding NATO. There are occasional outbursts, but I think the policy is pretty sober and sound. But some of the things that President Trump has said, which criticize NATO, contribute to the problem you described. But he also said something very specific, which truly contributed to the problem you described. When he said, "Well, I don't know if we'll be sending our weapons to some of our NATO allies in the future because they may no longer be our allies." And given European nervousness about the restrictions on the current weapons we've provided to them, including their clear interest in sending those weapons to Ukraine, they're giving European leaders, as they bulk up on defense spending, a reason to put far more of their resources into their own defense industries. And that does cut against America's commercial slash defense interests globally. So it's a mistake.
Yeah, so as we look back to President Trump and President Putin, who's playing whom? Is Putin playing Trump and stringing him along to avoid further wrath and to just try and extend the conflict? Or is Trump being very clever and playing Putin and backing him into a corner by suggesting that he's going to be on his side and give in to everything else, and then either get him to go to ceasefire talks or get him to a point where he's going to just go really hard on them?
We are in maybe the first act of what's supposed to be a multi-act drama of the Trump policy towards negotiating a peace, ending the war. At this point in time, just looking at the evidence, since we don't know what's ultimately in Trump's mind, on Trump's mind, Putin is playing Trump because it's been clear, even for people who need a great deal of evidence, it's been clear for the last 6 or 7 weeks that Russia has zero interest in a ceasefire. How many ceasefire proposals from the Trump administration has Ukraine accepted and Russia rejected? And Trump has taken criticism from his supporters. You mentioned that 61% of Americans, according to a poll, think Trump has been weak on Putin. That includes a fair number of Republicans, if you get 61%. Trump has been criticized for being weak on Russia by the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is generally supportive of Trump's policy. The New York Post editorial page, ditto, very supportive of Trump. And even some Republican senators and Congress folks who do worry about being primaried have expressed some concern about this. So this is why Trump, for literally 6 weeks now, not every week, not every day of the week, but 3 or 4 times over this period, has said that maybe he's being played by Putin in the Kremlin, and he needs to do something about it. But while he's said it, he has only on one occasion and very quietly done it. That one occasion, and he deserves praise for this, around 3 weeks ago, around the signing of the critical minerals deal, he took two decisions to allow our allies and partners to send a modest amount of American weapons to Ukraine. That's the first time that President Trump in this term has allowed American weapons to go to Ukraine. Now, that opens the door if Trump now were to announce, look, Mr. Putin, I see you haven't done much to establish a ceasefire. I'm going to agree now to an additional $2 billion of American weapons going to Ukraine. And if we haven't got this solved in another 4 weeks, it's going to be $10 billion. That would be a very serious form of pressure. We haven't seen that. I don't rule this out, but I don't know this is what's going to happen either.
So, going back to looking at things from a Putin perspective, it's clear that Zelensky maneuvered in this game of, we're probably 4D chess, if not 5D or 6D chess going on, maneuvered Putin into a difficult position by calling his bluff and Putin not turning up to the peace talks that he'd called in Turkey. But do you think Putin has managed to get to at least some point of resetting the game with this phone call that he's had with Trump? Or does he believe that, whether it's actual or not? Do you think he believes it?
Look, without a doubt, that phone call has put farther into the future a ceasefire. Because at this point in time, President Trump seems to be comfortable with the Putin position that the next step are these negotiations in Turkey. And we've seen what those negotiations in Turkey achieved last week. Like, yes, you did have the prisoner exchange. That was important, humanitarian gesture. But on the actual terms for establishing a ceasefire, it went nowhere. It was a step backward. And so, in a sense, President Trump has endorsed that step backward. Because when Putin left the phone call with Trump, he immediately went on Russian TV and talked about those same diktat conditions that Medinsky, his negotiator in Istanbul, put on the table. Now, actually, there's one more important point, which you mentioned. Rubio saying he's now expecting the terms from Russia of conditions. That's a smart play. That's Rubio's efforts to get Russia to put something that's workable, or alternatively, which is, I think, what any sound analyst expects. If it's not acceptable, it's one more piece of evidence that the Kremlin's not interested, which hopefully then could lead to pressure from the world's still most powerful nation, the United States.
So, Ambassador, you're seeing a maturing of some of the key individuals in the administration as they're dealing with the complexities of trying to get a ceasefire and everything else. Do you want to give us some of your thoughts and insights?
I was impressed by the performance of Vice President Vance last week in two ways. First, regarding Russia's aggression in Ukraine, Vance said publicly that, referring to the unsuccessful Istanbul talks relating to the ceasefire, he said the Russians are demanding too much. So basically saying what's very clear, that Russia is the problem in getting a ceasefire. But he did actually something last week which demonstrated substantial growth and a real achievement at the same time, not relating to the war in Europe, but relating to the confrontation between India and Pakistan. At the start of it, he said, well, there's really no U.S. role in this, which of course is wrong. But then we learned that he and Secretary of State Rubio were the guys working the phones to get the ceasefire. So Vance made a serious contribution, not just to U.S. security with that, but to global security, and in a way that was directly flew in the face of his initial reaction to the conflict, which demonstrates leadership and growth, and it's welcome to see.
Do you think he's been deliberately put in this position by President Trump to give him an apprenticeship to set him up to potentially be the next president?
That's, I think, a reasonable analysis. Uh, Vance is obviously a smart man, although not very well schooled in national security policy. But this is a great way to learn it. And I think that may well be the president's intention.
Who's got the lead in the US administration, apart from the president? Of course, he's got the lead, but in dealing with Putin, dealing with Russia, dealing with Ukraine, because we seem to get Witkoff going in to see Putin and getting involved. We've got JD Vance, and traditionally, and I may be getting this wrong as a Brit, not understanding US politics, but the US vice president didn't always seem to get involved in the wider geopolitics. That was left to the Secretary of State. We've got Marco Rubio coming in. And I remember looking at the video of the ambush of Zelensky in the Oval Office, if I describe it that way, and it was JD Vance that took the lead, but Marco Rubio sitting beside him on the sofa was looking very uncomfortable indeed. Who's leading, or is it all three just trying to advise the president who's leading himself?
Look, roughly speaking, there are two camps around the president regarding the Russian war in Ukraine. One camp recognizes, as the Russian national security strategy says, that the United States is considered by Russia to be its principal adversary. And that group understands that what Russia's doing in Ukraine is very dangerous for American interests in Europe and globally. Then there's another group which appears to be clueless about the threat posed by Russian national security policy to the United States and Russia's aggression in Ukraine and Russians' ambitions to go beyond Ukraine if they succeed in taking effective political control in Ukraine. And they are, for their whole variety of reasons, which we don't have time to go into right now, willing to allow Putin to take control of Ukraine. And they don't understand that this would be not just a major geopolitical defeat for the United States, but it would make Trump look like a truly failed national security president. And I think Trump sort of gets that last part, sort of gets it.
Do you think if that happened, Xi Jinping would turn around and go, that's a green light to take Taiwan by force?
Well, green light is a bit too strong, but it would give him much incentive to do so. Now, I think there's a senior official at the Pentagon who has made his reputation in the last 2 years claiming the only real threat we face is China. Let Russia do what it wants in Eastern Europe. It's amazing that official, before he became an official, continued to utter that geopolitical naivete in the face of the fact that after he made that point, the leaders of Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, who have far more stakes in this than that official, said publicly the best way to deter Xi from moving on Taiwan is to defeat Putin in Ukraine. And those three states people were absolutely right. And that's basic geopolitics.
Right. I want to use your experience as an ambassador now. What do you think the next steps are for each of the parties? US, Russia, Ukraine, and the coalition of the willing. And can you give us a flavor for what the diplomats the diplomats are the people that do the real work behind the scenes. What will they be doing now to try and make things move forward? And do you think that they're getting all the clear direction that they need from their leaders?
I think that on the one hand, again, you have a policy in Washington which is wavering between two very different possibilities. And I am not pessimistic about the ultimate conclusion of that struggle, you might say, for the year of the president. But I'm also not certain that we're going to get the right result. But my understanding is that the intransigence that Putin has demonstrated, despite a certain glad-handing approach to dealing with President Trump, which has served Putin well, has strengthened the hands, albeit not overwhelmingly, of the intelligent group in the administration that understands that Russia considers us to be its foe. responding to doubts about American commitment, not just to helping Ukraine survive this war, but also the American commitment to security in Europe. We've seen some very serious leadership from Macron, from Sturmer, now Merz. Thank goodness he's the new chancellor. Of course, the Poles have always been sound. The Balts have always been sound. But also the newest NATO members, Finland and Sweden. The Nordics have been sound also as a group. Uh, and, I had many conversations with my European colleagues after our election, uh, up to late January, describing how the ideas Trump laid out could achieve a stable peace, a durable peace. But those ideas, of course, included European forces deployed to Ukraine and very serious people whom I'd known for a long time. As late as uh, January before Davos, when I last saw a group of such European parliamentarians, scoffed at the notion of European troops going to Ukraine. And I told them, get serious. You're not stepping up to the moment. And no one in Europe was stepping up to the moment at that point in time. But after the some of the clumsy statements made by senior American officials around the Munich Security Conference, I think Macron came to understand this was an issue. And he's the first one who began to demonstrate a clear interest and need to develop this force. And Starmer quickly joined. And I think we saw support again from the countries I've mentioned, the Nordics, the Balts, and so on, the Poles. Czechia has also been very strong throughout this. And now you have some very serious ideas in motion. And I remember telling my European colleagues back in January and before that, that of course, for you to go in, you need serious support from the United States. And I said, there are three things you need. Two, I think, will be easily doable, but it will be doable, probably not too hard. Let's not make this too easy. One, of course, is logistical support. Two is intel support. But I said the third one is also essential for you. I can't tell you this will be easy, but that's what we call the American backstop. What happens when the Russians clearly decide to show the Europeans that they're going to pay a little bit of a price and shoot at the Europeans in Ukraine? And I remember telling my European colleagues, look, you can't be certain you'll get the right answer. But this idea of European troops in Ukraine to stop the war, to put real deterrence, is a Trump idea. And if this becomes the single thing needed to make this idea work, I think there's a decent chance, even a good chance, that the Trump team would go along. And I think this is the game being played right now with a great deal of skill from those European leaders. Talking to Trump regularly. It's worth noting that first Macron and then Starmer were in the Oval Office days before the infamous Zelensky meeting. And you are not wrong to call it an ambush. Zelensky was the least rude of the three speakers in the Oval Office at that time. But Zelensky clearly mishandled that meeting. He was told by many people, do not go on and on about the security guarantee and about you can't trust Russia. Zelensky had to make that point, and he could have done it in 2 minutes. There would have been no blow up.
Interesting, but there's a lot I agree with President Trump's policy on Europe and looking at it. And I'm going to put a bit of a hypothesis to you and see whether you agree with this or not. There are three major conflicts around the world. There's Europe with Russia, Ukraine. We've got the Middle East, and that's continuously there and is growing. It's not shrinking. And then we've got the potential in Southeast Asia with China and Taiwan. But that could stimulate quite easily a massive regional conflict that would suck in an awful lot more. From a United States perspective, the priority number one is Southeast Asia, because that's where the majority of economics lie. Number two is Middle East and stability because of its global implications, but also energy implications and everything else. And number three is Europe. And European nations for too many years have relied on a United States, not backstop, but complete defensive line to stop Europe then spending dollars or euros on its own defense, which was then investing in different industries that were then competing with US industry and had therefore an unfair advantage. And therefore, President Trump is actually looking after US interests in just the right way by forcing Europe to step up. But that's going to have implications further down the line on US trade in Europe and reset a little bit of what's going on globally. And I don't think that's been properly thought through from a second and third order perspective. What do you think?
I think your analysis about the impact in Europe of Trump's policies is exactly right. And I don't think that the administration has considered what this might mean, even if it all works out very well, which it might. And we will adjust to that as it happens. But I would also add that uh, I think the administration could achieve that increase in European spending in a slightly more subtle, less combative way, which, were that to happen, would reduce the negative consequences which you've described. But there's something else I wanted to add where I have a different view than yours. Um, I think that, of course, in the long run, the greatest national security challenge to the United States comes from China. Because China, unlike Russia, has a real economy, has a world, a modern economy. But the greatest short-term danger to the United States, greater than the Western Pacific, greater than the Middle East, is Putin's war in Ukraine. Because if Putin wins this war, and the only way Putin wins this war is if his bet on Western fecklessness proves right. And that starts first and foremost with decisions made in the White House. There's going to be further danger in Europe. And of course, the chance of Xi moving on Taiwan goes way up. So that's why we've got to get this right. And I think that's understood by the sober minds in the administration. It's clearly not understood by the naive minds in the administration. And I'm not certain where the commander in chief is on that. But I do believe, as I think I just mentioned before, that as a result of the clear signs of Russian intransigence, the more sober thinkers in the administration are in slightly better light now than they were, say, 2 months ago.
I'll not ask you to name who the naive thinkers are. I think we can all work that out. One of the things that Putin is likely to put into these peace call, a requirement for peace talks and all the rest of it, is what he keeps going on about his elections in Ukraine, because and we've heard out of the U.S. administration suggestions that the elections may not have been as free and fair as they could be, but that was just backing some of the statements that Putin was coming out with. You've been involved in Ukrainian elections since the Orange Revolution and watching them. Are they free and fair? Is Zelensky there in it from a perfectly legitimate perspective?
Absolutely, he won a free and fair election. Not a perfect election, but a free and fair one. It's an amazing thing. Every Ukrainian national election, presidential election, not necessarily parliamentary election, since independence has been ultimately a fair one, ultimately a free one. Otherwise, the first president of Ukraine, who kind of inherited the job, would not have lost to Kuchma. And the only election that was rigged was the second round of the 2004 election when I was in Ukraine, and that led to the Orange Revolution, which led to a fair election. But when Yanukovych beat Yushchenko deserved credit for overseeing a free and fair election. And when Poroshenko won the election after Yanukovych fled following the Maidan Revolution, was free and fair. And Zelensky's election was free and fair. So Ukraine has a pretty good record. Would that Russia had such elections.
We can't get better analysis than that. Finally, what do you think the levers are that we should be using now to influence Putin, to force him to come up with a ceasefire and to go to the peace table? Or can we not force him?
Oh, we can't quote unquote force him, but we could put conditions in place which makes his war of aggression far more difficult to continue. So I agree that there are sanctions that can be taken which would impose an even greater cost on the Russian economy. There have been some efforts to go after the Russian ghost fleet, which allows them to put out their oil in the face of the sanctions. A lot more can be done on that. There's the idea, Lindsey Graham's idea, of putting a huge tariff on countries that buy Russian oil and gas. That would also have an impact. We should certainly, the Trump team should follow up on the good work the Biden team did in its last 8 or 10 months in office on getting our G7 partners to agree to give Ukraine the $300 billion in frozen Russian state assets. That's an important measure. And in fact, Scott Bessent was talking about this after the election, but before the inauguration. But that kind of just went south, not south, silent. But more important than that are major weapon supplies to Ukraine. President Trump should do something along the lines I mentioned earlier. Announce $500 million or $1 billion or $2 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine. Now, obviously, under the new Trump rules, that's not going to be an American gift. So we'll figure out a way for that to be paid for. And at the time that's announced, maybe someone on background says, if there's no ceasefire in a month, we're going to see $5 billion or $6 billion worth of more weapons heading to Ukraine. That's something which tells Putin he's not going to win further on the battlefield. He thinks right now he's making gains, albeit at a horrific human cost, including for Russian soldiers. Of course, he doesn't give a damn about Russian deaths, whether in his gulag or on the battlefield in Ukraine. But if he's suddenly not making any gains whatsoever, and we have the ability to do that with a sound policy.
No, interesting, and with those insights, I think that's a very good point to stop, because there's lots more that we could talk about and go on all afternoon. But that gives us an opportunity for another episode. Ambassador, many thanks for chatting to me on Frontline today.
Thank you, my pleasure. Always happy to be with you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like to be amongst the first to get exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership at the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs, or read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.